معرفة.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. We will discuss about four structure. The first is about Murabaha. The second is Musawama. The third is about Bi Thaman Ajal. This is also referred as BBA. The fourth is Tawarruq. So these are some of the structures which we will cover. So this would be Murabaha, Musawama, Bai' Thaman Ajal and Tawarruq. So important principles. Number one is prior to the contract. Number two is contracting parties. Number three is subject matter. Number four is conclusion of contract. Number five is, for example, guarantee. And number six is prepayment, or default. Now these are certain important principles which we have to understand with respect to the four contracts which I have just briefly explained to you. Let us start with the principle prior to contract. And here the important thing which we have to understand is with reference to promise to purchase. And the security deposit. Generally, in case of Murabaha transactions or other kind of sale transactions which we have discussed, there is a promise to purchase which is given by the customer in favor of the bank, saying that once the bank purchases the assets for the customer, generally, now let us talk about the principle of prior to contract. And the important part in this principle is with reference to promise to purchase. And under promise to purchase, an important thing which we have to understand is about the security deposit, which is also called as Hamish Jiddiya in Hamish Jiddiya. Now this is an Arabic terminology, but for us to understand, this is nothing but a security deposit given by the customer to the bank and promising the bank that once the bank purchases the asset, the customer would purchase those assets from the bank. Now, one important point here for us to understand is that in case if the customer fails to purchase, then the bank has the full right, then the bank has the right to deduct the actual losses which the bank has incurred in purchasing the asset, and the bank has incurred actual losses in purchasing those assets. For example, if the bank has not purchased the asset and the customer does not want to execute the sale transaction, then the bank has to return the whole security deposit which it has taken from the customer. So with reference to prior to contract, as we have discussed, the important point is the promise to purchase, generally which is given by the customer in favor of the bank, promising the bank that if the bank purchases those assets, the customer would in turn purchase those assets from the bank. And for this to become more concretized, generally the customer also pays a security deposit to the bank. The second part which we have to understand is with reference to the contracting parties. Now, the two main contracting parties in the four sale transaction which we have, the two main contracting parties in the sale transactions which we are discussing are generally the seller and the purchaser. And of course, the general principle of contract which we have studied, that these two parties should have legal capacity, also applies here. And these are the two main contracting parties, that is the seller and the purchaser. The third principle which we talked about is with reference to the subject matter. Now here, there are certain things which we have to clearly understand. Number one, which is an important thing, which is quite important, is that the asset has to be clearly defined. The asset has to be identified. The third is an important point with reference to ownership. What it means is that the seller should have either the physical ownership or the constructive ownership of the asset before the seller is making the sale transaction. If the seller is not having either the physical ownership or the constructive ownership, then the sale is not a valid sale. The physical ownership is very clear. The physical ownership means that the seller needs to have the physical possession of the asset which the seller is selling it to the purchaser. In this case, the seller being the bank and the purchaser being the customer. Sometimes it's not necessary that the physical ownership rests with the bank, but the constructive ownership, meaning to say that the legal ownership is with the bank. So maybe the customer has bought a car, but the car is not in the physical ownership of the bank, but the bank owns the car through a purchase agreement which the bank has signed it with the car dealer. So that is the constructive ownership. So but an important thing which we have to realize is that it has to be either physical or constructive, but ownership is very important, meaning to say that the seller needs to have the proper ownership of the asset before the seller is selling the asset to the purchaser. This is another important point which we have to understand with reference to the subject matter of the four contracts which we have discussed. Now let us discuss about the fourth principle, which is the conclusion of contract. As we have earlier discussed, that for a contract to be concluded, there has to be a proper offer and there has to be an acceptance. So the fourth principle talks about conclusion of contract, and in the conclusion of the contract there is an offer which is made by the seller and there is an acceptance which is made by the purchaser. As we have discussed, the nature of offer and acceptance is generally based on the customary practices.